Donald Trump posted on social media this morning that Canada's been ripping off the United States for years, called Canadian tariffs on American farmers ridiculously high, and ended his post with 3 words in capital letters: "Not anymore." He followed that post by threatening to double tariffs on Canadian cars and car parts to 50% starting January 1st. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's response, delivered that same day in an interview with the Associated Press, was considerably sharper. "If Trump keeps attacking Canadian manufacturing," Ford said, "he better have a pack of batteries, because Ontario is prepared to cut off the high-grade nickel and refined uranium the American defense and manufacturing sectors depend on entirely." "You won't get a grain of sand out of Ontario," Ford said. That is where this trade war actually sits this morning. An American president escalating with public threats and social media posts, and a Canadian government responding not with panic, but with a level of calm, coordinated defiance that has genuinely caught much of the American business and political establishment off guard. To understand exactly how Canada got here, and why several serious voices inside the American business and political establishment are now calling this fight one their own country cannot realistically win, we need to rebuild the sequence carefully. On July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 presidential proclamations targeting Canadian autos, alcohol, and dairy with 50% tariffs. That deadline expired late Friday night when Prime Minister Mark Carney suspended negotiations entirely, citing last-minute American demands he called unacceptable, restricting auto tariff relief, limiting Canada's ability to sign trade deals with other countries, and weakening protections for Canadian language and culture. The tariffs took effect at 12:01 a.m. Saturday, hitting roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods. Carney answered within just a few hours, announcing dollar-for-dollar retaliation targeting American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp, paper, and electronics set to take effect September 8th. And then, rather than this settling into a quiet standoff, Trump escalated again on Monday, threatening to double the existing tariff on Canadian vehicles and posting publicly that Canada's tariff structure on American farmers was not sustainable, and not anymore. The way Carney has framed this entire confrontation in plain blunt language rather than careful diplomatic hedging is itself part of the story. "You're at war when you're attacked, and we got attacked," Carney told reporters in Ottawa over the weekend. "We cannot accept what they've offered, and we will not give what they've asked." He acknowledged the resulting tariffs will raise costs for Canadians in the near term, but remained confident the decision serves the country's longer-term interest. That combination, acknowledging real economic pain while refusing to back down, is a considerably different posture than the one Carney held through most of this dispute when critics, including his own former Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, had warned publicly that Ottawa appeared to be quietly conceding ground. Whatever else this week has done, it has resolved that criticism decisively, at least for now. Now, Ford's specific threats become genuinely significant, because they are not simply rhetorical bluster from a provincial politician. They target precisely the categories of Canadian resource exports, where American dependency runs deepest, and where substitution options are, at least in the near term, essentially non-existent. Ford specifically named high-grade nickel shipped from Ontario into American manufacturing and uranium refined in the province for use in American energy and defense applications. Critical minerals like these have become an increasingly urgent priority for Washington's national security establishment, with the Pentagon actively working to secure supplies for military aircraft, missiles, and advanced electronics, specifically to reduce reliance on China, which currently dominates global mining and processing capacity for many of these materials. Ford's question to reporters, what would they do without the high-grade nickel we ship down to the US, is not rhetorical flourish. It is pointing directly at a supply chain vulnerability American defense planners have spent years trying to solve, one that Ontario currently sits inside as one of the few reliable, geopolitically friendly sources available. This is not the first time Ford has reached for exactly this kind of leverage. Back in early 2025, when this trade war first began, Ford actually followed through on a threat to impose a 25% surcharge on electricity Ontario exports to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, a move that raised roughly $400,000 a day before Washington threatened to double steel and aluminum tariffs in direct response, prompting Ford to quickly reverse course. That history matters because it shows Ford's threats have oscillated between genuine follow-through and negotiating leverage, which is exactly why this week's renewed threat deserves to be read as a serious escalation rather than simply more of the same rhetoric. The reaction inside the American business and financial press this week has been striking. Fortune's CEO Daily newsletter ran a piece arguing directly that the United States is unlikely to win what it called a dumb trade war with Canada, noting that Trump's options are limited precisely because this latest round of tariffs only touches about 5% of Canadian imports into the United States. The piece pointed to something that rarely makes it into political coverage. The two economies remain deeply intertwined at the infrastructure level. One Canadian chief executive captured the deeper risk better than any single tariff percentage could. In a dumb trade war, you eventually work out the trade, but you never regain the trust. That erosion of trust is showing up in measurable ways inside Canadian public opinion. Canadian public opinion has turned largely on the direct attacks coming from Trump personally, a shift that has consolidated support behind Ottawa's harder line in a way that was not present during earlier phases of this trade war. This consolidation showed up clearly over the weekend with Canada's political leaders, across parties and provinces, uniting behind Carney's decision to walk away from the negotiating table. Ford himself, despite pushing for a harder line than Carney throughout most of this dispute, gave the Prime Minister his full public support this weekend, telling reporters, "It will be painful, but we have a strong, vibrant, diversified economy." That's considerably more supportive of the federal government's approach than Ford's public posture during the fractured Charlottetown summit in July, when he stood largely alone among the premiers in pushing for aggressive retaliation. The fact that Ford is now willing to revisit critical minerals leverage more explicitly and specifically than his earlier broader threats around electricity suggests either that political consensus inside Ontario has hardened considerably, or that Ford has calculated Washington's vulnerability on critical minerals specifically is significant enough to make this particular threat more credible. Ford has been careful, even amid this escalation, to draw a real distinction between threatening retaliation and actually abandoning negotiations. "I never believe in walking away from the table," he told the Associated Press this week, adding that Canada should continue negotiating and see where things go, even while preparing increasingly severe retaliatory measures if Trump continues targeting Canadian industries. That nuance mirrors almost exactly the posture Carney himself has taken at the federal level, defiant and willing to escalate, but not interested in permanently severing a relationship that remains one of the largest bilateral trading relationships on the planet. Both leaders appear to be pursuing the same strategy: demonstrate genuine willingness to inflict real economic pain rather than simply absorb it, while leaving the door open for negotiated resolution that does not require Canada to accept terms it considers fundamentally unfair. The economic backdrop matters here. This week's escalation landed on an economy that had just started showing real signs of recovery after 18 months of tariff-driven turbulence. Early data from Statistics Canada had real gross domestic product on track for solid growth in the second quarter of 2026, coming off small contractions in the previous 2 quarters. A fragile but genuine sign of momentum that economists warned this week is now directly at risk. Bank of Montreal expects the tariffs that took effect Saturday alone to carve a full 0.5 percentage point off Canadian economic growth. That economic pressure is exactly why Ford's willingness to threaten Ontario's own critical minerals exports carries real weight, rather than reading as empty political theatre. It demonstrates a government willing to accept genuine economic cost to itself in pursuit of leverage against a much larger trading partner. The underlying vulnerability around critical minerals runs deeper than most trade war coverage acknowledges. Washington has spent considerable diplomatic and financial capital trying to build alternative supply chains to reduce Chinese dependency, working with allied nations including Canada, Australia, and several African and South American countries. Ontario's high-grade nickel and refined uranium sit precisely inside that diversification strategy, representing exactly the kind of geopolitically friendly allied nation supply Washington has been trying to cultivate as an alternative to Chinese-controlled sources. Ford's threat to cut off that specific supply in the middle of a trade dispute Washington itself initiated exposes a genuinely uncomfortable strategic contradiction. An administration working to reduce dependency on one geopolitical rival while simultaneously picking a fight with one of the few reliable alternative suppliers it has spent years cultivating. Consider what all of this means for how each side is likely to approach the days immediately ahead, with September 8th sitting on the calendar as the date Canada's own retaliatory tariffs formally take effect. Trump's Monday escalation threatening to double auto tariffs specifically adds a second deadline into a dispute that already had one. If Washington follows through on doubling auto tariffs come January, while Canada's own retaliatory measures are already active from September, the cumulative effect on cross-border auto manufacturing, an industry where parts frequently cross the border multiple times during a single vehicle's production, could reach a scale of disruption considerably beyond anything either government's public statements have fully acknowledged. That is precisely the kind of compounding risk market analysts have been flagging in their notes to clients this week, less concerned with any single tariff announcement in isolation, and more concerned with how quickly this dispute is adding new fronts faster than either side is resolving the fronts that already existed. There's one more piece worth understanding clearly, because it explains why Carney's specific choice of words, "You're at war when you're attacked, and we got attacked," resonated so strongly across Canadian media coverage. That framing deliberately positions Canada as the party responding to aggression rather than initiating conflict. A rhetorical choice that matters enormously for how this dispute gets understood both domestically and internationally. Trump's own Monday social media post accusing Canada of ripping off the United States and declaring current arrangements not sustainable represents the mirror image framing, positioning Washington as the party finally correcting a long-standing imbalance. Both governments are in effect competing over which side gets to claim the position of the wronged party, a battle that matters politically on both sides of the border, even though it does relatively little to resolve the actual substantive disagreements over auto tariffs, dairy access, and critical mineral supply chains. The key context this time is that Ford is no longer speaking in isolation the way he often was during the Charlottetown summit in July. This week he is speaking with federal backing in the immediate aftermath of Carney's own decision to walk away from the negotiating table, a considerably more unified political position than existed during any of his previous rounds of critical minerals brinkmanship. That shift toward unified political messaging across federal and provincial lines is itself worth dwelling on, because Canadian federalism has historically made this kind of coordinated economic response difficult to achieve. Trade and resource policy in Canada is split across federal and provincial jurisdiction in ways that frequently produce disagreement. Different premiers pursuing different strategies based on how exposed their own provincial economies are to any given form of retaliation. This week's apparent convergence, Ford backing Carney's walkout, other premiers largely following suit rather than publicly second-guessing the federal approach, suggests that direct escalation from Washington over the past several days has done more to unify Canadian political strategy than months of careful federal diplomacy managed on its own. What happens over the coming days and weeks will not just determine whether Canadian nickel and uranium actually stop flowing south, or whether Trump follows through on doubling auto tariffs come January. It will determine whether this becomes the moment historians eventually point to as the point this relationship fundamentally changed, the moment a trusted, deeply integrated ally decided it would rather absorb real immediate economic pain than continue accepting terms it considered fundamentally unfair. Or whether, like so many previous flashpoints across this 18-month dispute, both sides eventually find their way back to a negotiating table once the costs on each side become too high to sustain. That remains the open question hanging over this entire confrontation. But as of this morning, with an American president posting all-caps declarations on social media and a Canadian premier calmly suggesting Washington had better stockpile batteries, it is very clearly Ottawa, not Washington, setting the tone of this fight.